The night Craik finally made his move arrived on a bitter evening in late February, the man slipping from the oak's shadow toward the cottage's rear window with the careful, practiced movement of someone who had indeed spent considerable weeks learning exactly when the household's attention would be turned elsewhere. He did not anticipate Julian's own men waiting in the darkness, nor Julian himself positioned near the cottage's front approach with a pistol he had, until that cold night, never once expected to need drawn in genuine earnest. Craik was taken, with the manuscript's location already marked on a hand-drawn diagram found in his coat, along with correspondence confirming his intention to sell the Book of Hours, once stolen, to a considerably less scrupulous collector on the continent, who cared nothing for how a rare manuscript came into his possession, provided the price proved satisfactory. The formal hearing held before the county magistrate the following week revealed to the whole gathered parish exactly what genuine danger had been unfolding beneath their frightened, misdirected suspicion these past months. Cordelia testified plainly, laying out the manuscript's true nature, the legitimate trade that required her discretion, and her candle-lit hours, and the considerable danger Craik's careful, patient surveillance had actually posed, not merely to her own safety, but to a piece of England's genuine cultural heritage that her skilled hands had been quietly, honestly working to preserve. Julian testified alongside her, confirming the timeline of his own inquiry, Craik's dismissal from Mr. Vane's household, and the diagram and correspondence recovered upon the man's capture, evidence considerably more damning than any village whisper had ever managed to construct against Cordelia herself. The magistrate, hearing the full accounting, dismissed entirely any lingering suspicion of witchcraft or dark ritual that had shadowed Cordelia's reputation these past difficult months, and committed Craik to trial for attempted theft and conspiracy, the evidence against him considerably more solid than any accusation the village had ever managed to raise against the woman he had actually meant to victimize. The room, hearing the full truth laid plainly before it, went quiet with the particular uncomfortable realization of a great many people recognizing exactly how badly their fear had been aimed, and exactly how close that fear had come to leaving Cordelia entirely undefended against a genuine and considerable danger, while the whole parish busied itself instead with imaginary rituals that had never once existed. Julian rose before the assembled parish and spoke plainly of what these past months had taught him. "I'll say this clearly," he said, "so that no further gossip may construct its own version of events. I've come to care for Miss Ashe considerably and honestly across these past months, watching her skill, her discretion, and her genuine courage in the face of a danger this parish never troubled to notice while it busied itself fearing candlelight instead. I'll not have that honest feeling dismissed as enchantment when the only true darkness in this matter belonged to a thief's greed and this village's own frightened imagination. The whispering did not vanish overnight, but it changed shape considerably in the months that followed, the way fear generally changes shape once forced to stand plainly beside honest evidence. Cordelia's trade grew in time considerably beyond what Milbeck's small parish had ever previously supported, her reputation for careful, discreet restoration work spreading through Mr. Vane's own grateful recommendation to collectors across the country who valued precisely the skill and discretion the village had once so badly misjudged. She and Julian married the following autumn, and Thornfield Hall's own neglected library became, under her careful hands, one of the finest private collections in the county, restored patiently, page by page, in the same steady candlelight that had once made an entire parish afraid of her. The candlelight still moved through her windows most nights, steady and purposeful as it had always been, and the village, walking past now, no longer troubled itself to whisper about what that light might mean. They simply understood at last exactly what it had always meant. Careful hands doing careful work in the only light precise enough to let her do it properly. They feared her midnight rituals because a frightened village needed something simple to explain what it didn't understand. They were wrong, because the only real danger in the dark was a thief nobody else had troubled to notice, and it took one duke who refused to look away to finally see what she'd been protecting all along. If this one kept you watching the window as closely as Julian did, comment the candlelight below, tell us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so the next story finds you. The next one is already waiting.
Every night, at the same hour, candlelight moved through her windows. The village watched it from a safe distance and decided among themselves exactly what that light meant. Rituals, incantations, something no decent woman would do while honest people slept. Nobody asked why. Nobody except the Duke, who rode past her cottage one night purely by accident and found himself unable to look away from a woman working with more care and more purpose at midnight than most people managed in broad daylight. He didn't yet know why she could only work after dark. By the time he found out, he understood that the answer was going to cost him considerably more than his own comfortable ignorance. Cordelia Ashe had lived at Thornfield Cottage on the edge of the parish of Milbeck for 4 years, since her father's death had left her the small stone house and a debt she had spent every one of those 4 years quietly working to repay. She was a bookbinder by trade, trained by her father, who had himself learned the craft from a master in York before consumption took him too early to see his daughter properly established in a business of her own. Cordelia had inherited his tools, his careful hands, and his considerable skill, but she had not inherited anything resembling the steady trade a bookbinder in a larger town might expect, since Milbeck was a small parish with few enough books in it to require regular binding, and fewer patrons still willing to trust so particular a craft to an unmarried woman working alone. What she had found instead in the 2 years since her father's death had left the debt fully hers to answer for, was a considerably stranger source of income, one she guarded with a carefulness that had, over time, curdled into exactly the sort of suspicious village whisper that guarded secrets invite. She restored rare books and manuscripts for a small circle of private collectors across 3 counties, wealthy men who valued discretion as highly as skill, and who paid her, through careful arrangement, a sum considerably beyond what any ordinary bookbinding trade in a parish like Milbeck could ever hope to produce. The work itself required a precision that daylight, with its shifting angles and its curious passers-by glancing through her front window, made considerably more difficult than the steady, controlled light of candles burning late into the night when the village had gone to bed and no one troubled to watch her hands at their careful labor. She worked after dark, in other words, for reasons entirely practical and entirely explainable had anyone in Milbeck ever troubled to ask her directly, rather than construct their own explanation from a safe distance. Nobody had asked. The whisper had begun, as these things generally begin, with something small. Old Mr. Pruitt, walking home late from the alehouse one autumn evening, had glimpsed candlelight moving strangely through Cordelia's front window, her shadow bent low over her workbench in a manner that, filtered through several pints of ale and a dark lane's natural tendency toward imagination, had struck him as considerably more sinister than a woman simply working late at careful, close labor. By the following market day, the story had grown teeth. Cordelia Ashe kept strange hours. Cordelia Ashe would not say what she did behind her shuttered windows after decent folk had retired. Cordelia Ashe, several of the more imaginative tongues in the parish began to suggest, was engaged in something considerably darker than any honest trade would require the cover of midnight to conceal. Cordelia heard the shape of it from Mrs. Tilby, the baker's wife, the one woman in the parish who had never entirely joined the general suspicion, arriving at her cottage one afternoon with a basket of bread and a carefully worried expression. "They're saying you conduct rituals. I don't credit myself, understand, but I've heard it said in 3 kitchens this week, and I thought you'd rather hear it plainly from a friendly mouth. I bind books, Mrs. Tilby, and I restore old manuscripts for gentlemen who pay me considerably better for discretion than any ordinary bookbinding trade in a parish like Milbeck could ever compensate me for revealing my patrons' names. I work at night because the light suits the labor. There is no ritual beyond careful hands and a steady candle. I believe you, though I'd wager the village believes considerably less of it should the whispering continue to grow." The whispering did continue to grow through that autumn and into the beginning of winter, and Cordelia, unwilling to compromise the privacy her patrons paid so well to secure, found herself with no honest way to answer the suspicion without revealing precisely the information her livelihood depended on keeping quiet. Duke Julian Thorne had inherited Milbeck's principal estate only the previous spring, upon his elder brother's unexpected death,
and he had spent the intervening months learning with the particular careful attention of a man who had never expected the responsibility to fall to him so soon, exactly what manner of parish and what manner of people he now found himself steward over.
He rode out on a cold December evening for no particular reason beyond the restlessness that had followed him since his brother's funeral, the sort of aimless ride a man takes when his own house feels too full of memory and too empty of anyone left to share it with. And it was purely by accident, taking a lane he did not usually travel, that he found himself passing Thornfield Cottage at an hour considerably past when any respectable household ought to still show candlelight in its windows. He noticed the light because it was steady, and because something in its steadiness struck him as considerably more purposeful than the flickering, restless quality gossip generally attaches to whatever it fears. He drew his horse up at the lane's edge, telling himself he meant only to satisfy an idle curiosity before continuing home, and found himself, through the imperfect gap where the shutter did not quite close flush against the frame, watching a woman bent carefully over a workbench, her hands moving with a precision that held his attention considerably longer than idle curiosity alone could account for. He did not knock that first night. He simply watched a while from the cold lane and rode home, turning the image over his mind considerably more than he expected a moment's idle curiosity to warrant. He returned 3 nights later, this time with genuine purpose rather than accident, and knocked properly at her door. Cordelia opened it with the particular wary caution of a woman who had grown accustomed these past weeks to unwelcome scrutiny, and found herself considerably surprised to discover the Duke of Millback himself standing at her doorstep at so late an hour. "Your Grace," she said, "I confess I did not expect a visit at this hour from anyone, let alone yourself." "I confess I did not expect to be making one," Julian said. "I passed this way 3 nights ago entirely by accident, and found myself considerably more curious about your candlelight than I expected a passing rider to be." "Then you've heard the village's explanation for it," Cordelia said, something careful entering her voice. "I've heard the village's explanation," Julian agreed. "I find myself, examining it honestly, considerably more skeptical of frightened gossip than I am curious about what you're actually doing behind that window. May I ask rather than assume?" Cordelia studied him a long moment, weighing the plain honesty of that request against weeks of accumulated suspicion that had never once bothered to ask her anything directly. "You may ask," she said, "though I'll tell you plainly, Your Grace, that my answer touches upon the privacy of patrons who pay me handsomely to keep their business quiet, and I'll not compromise that privacy simply to satisfy a curious duke, however well-intentioned his curiosity." "Then tell me only what you're comfortable telling," Julian said. "I find I'd rather have an honest, partial answer than a village's dishonest, full one." Something in Cordelia's carefully guarded composure eased just slightly at the plain reasonableness of that request. "Come in, then," she said, "before Mr. Pruitt or someone equally observant reports a duke standing at my open door for the whole parish to construct their own version of it. I need you to sit with me here a moment, because what Julian found inside that cottage is the reason this entire mystery eventually unraveled into something considerably more dangerous than mere village suspicion, and I promise you the truth took its time revealing itself properly. The workshop, when Cordelia led him through to it, held nothing remotely resembling the sinister scene the village's imagination had constructed. A sturdy workbench, careful rows of binding tools, jars of paste and thread, and spread carefully across a clean cloth in the steady candlelight, a manuscript of considerable age, its leather binding split and fragile, pages loose and in need of careful, patient reassembly. This belongs to a collector in York, a 15th century book of hours, considerably valuable, considerably fragile. I work on it only by candlelight because daylight's shifting angles make the fine stitching work I have to perform on pages this old and this brittle considerably more difficult than steady, controlled light allows. And I work at night specifically because my patron values discretion above nearly everything else, and a bookbinder's cottage receiving curious daytime visitors asking after so valuable a manuscript invites exactly the kind of attention that could see it stolen before I've finished the repair. Julian studied the manuscript with genuine, careful interest, understanding, looking at the delicate work spread before him, exactly how much precision and how much quiet skill the restoration required. "This is remarkable work," he said. "I confess I now understand why daylight would prove a poor companion to it. Most of the parish has never troubled to ask," Cordelia said. "It's easier to whisper witchcraft than to imagine a woman capable of skill this precise." "Then the parish has failed you rather badly," Julian said, "and I find myself, having seen this, considerably more troubled by that failure than I was troubled by any curiosity about your candlelight." He returned the following week, and the week after, ostensibly to examine the manuscript's progress, though both of them understood across those careful late visits that considerably more than professional curiosity had begun drawing him back each time.
"My own collection at Thornfield Hall wants proper attention," he admitted, one cold January evening, watching her careful hands work a fine needle through fragile vellum. "My grandfather assembled it, and my brother, God rest him, never had the patience for books that my grandfather did. I confess I'd welcome your professional eye upon it, Miss Ashe, though I'll admit the confession carries rather more hope of continued acquaintance than mere professional interest alone requires." "You should be careful what you admit aloud, Your Grace," Cordelia said, though something in her careful composure had eased across their shared weeks into something considerably warmer than the guarded distance she'd maintained with every other visitor this suspicious winter had brought her. "This parish has already decided I conduct rituals in the dark. I'd not have them decide I've bewitched its duke as well." "Let them decide whatever they please," Julian said.
I find I care considerably less what a frightened parish whispers than I care about the particular way these past weeks, watching you work, have taught me exactly what genuine skill looks like, stripped of every suspicious rumor. It was in early February, some 2 months into Julian's regular evening visits, that Cordelia first noticed something considerably more troubling than village gossip watching her cottage. A figure at the lane's edge, most nights now, standing at a careful distance in the shadow of the old oak that marked the boundary of her small property, watching her candle-lit window with an attention that felt, unlike the village's fearful whispering, considerably more deliberate and considerably less easily dismissed. She mentioned it to Julian on his next visit, watching his composed expression shift into something more alert as she described the figure's patient, watchful presence. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "A fortnight, perhaps longer," Cordelia admitted. "I confess I assumed at first it was simply another villager satisfying frightened curiosity, but this figure comes considerably more often than idle curiosity generally sustains, and watches considerably longer than any passing glance requires." Julian's expression had gone carefully still, the particular stillness of a man turning a troubling possibility over with genuine concern. "You're working, at present, on the York Collector's manuscript," he said slowly. "How widely is it known that so valuable a piece currently sits in your keeping?" "Only my patron himself, and now yourself," Cordelia said. "I've been considerably careful about that particular discretion, Your Grace, given precisely the value at stake." "Then either your carefulness has failed somewhere along the chain," Julian said, "or someone has learned of the manuscript's location through means considerably less honest than simple village gossip." He began from that evening forward, arriving considerably earlier and staying considerably later, positioning himself more than once at her own darkened window to watch the lane himself, rather than simply take her account of the figure's presence on faith alone. And on the third such evening he confirmed with his own eyes exactly what she had described. A man, cloaked against the cold, standing motionless in the oak's shadow, watching the cottage's candle-lit window with an attention that held nothing of idle curiosity in it. Julian did not approach that first night, understanding the value of observation over confrontation, but he began over the following week a quiet inquiry of his own, working through his own estate connections and the York Collector's correspondence to determine exactly who might have learned of the manuscript's presence at Thornfield Cottage and why. The answer, when it finally emerged, proved considerably more dangerous than either of them had initially feared. The York Collector, a careful and elderly gentleman named Mr. Ezekiel Vane, responded to Julian's discreet inquiry with considerable alarm of his own, revealing in the course of their careful correspondence that his own household had recently dismissed a secretary named Mr. Aldous Crake, discovered some months prior to have been quietly cataloguing his employer's most valuable holdings with an eye toward information he had no legitimate need to possess. Crake had been dismissed quietly, without formal accusation, Vane's own caution regarding scandal outweighing his desire for proper justice, and it was, Julian understood, examining the timeline carefully against Cordelia's own account of the watching figure's first appearance,
entirely possible that Craik, having learned through his former position exactly which valuable manuscripts had been sent where for restoration, had traced the Book of Hours to Cordelia's cottage with considerably more sinister intention than simple curiosity. "He means to steal it," Cordelia said, understanding dawning slowly across her composed features as Julian laid out what his inquiry had uncovered. "He's watching to learn my habits, my hours, precisely when the cottage stands emptiest and the manuscript most vulnerable. That would explain the pattern of his watching, always at night, always at a careful distance, learning the rhythm of your work rather than simply satisfying curiosity." "Then we've very little time," Cordelia said, "before he judges he understands that rhythm well enough to act on it." They worked together across the following days to construct a plan that would draw Craik into confirming his intentions before he could act on them, Julian arranging quietly for 2 of his own trusted estate men to watch the cottage's rear approach on the nights Cordelia continued her work, while she herself maintained her ordinary candlelit routine, giving no outward sign that her suspicion of the watching figure had been confirmed.